there's a quote that comes to mind, which I'd read from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet dissident. And I suspect we'll get into this quite a lot later when we discuss one of your concepts that you've coined, Dominion Capital, which is how people respond to these things that they see in the world and come up with an explanation. But we'll save that for later. He wrote that human beings are born with different capacities, and if they're free, they're not equal. And if they're equal, they're not free, which suggests that any attempt to equalize these outcomes which you've been talking about inevitably leads to, or is inevitably enabled by, a loss of freedom. Someone's trying to impose those outcomes. So parking that for a little while, let's think about our responses typically to the world in policy, in politics, is to try to equalize everything in some way. There's got to be a third party to come in and do it. Why do you think that looking at the world through this hereditarian understanding, all of the interplays between gene and environment and traits and culture, might lead to better political decisions than trying to force through egalitarianism in some of the ways that we've discussed it, beyond equality before the law and equality of dignity?
There's an interesting tension here, because just assuming that every group should be equal, and if they're not, there's something wrong. That in a way is a very simple, even convenient way to look at the world. But it then leads to, you have to engage in a whole lot of policy complexity to try and make all that work. Conversely, if you say, well, it's actually quite complicated and you can expect lots and lots of people to have disparate outcomes and you can't expect groups to have equal outcomes, that oddly enough actually simplifies policy, because you just got to say, right, we're going to have the same rules for everyone and the same tests for everybody, and then we let the chips fall where they may. That's actually a simpler architecture of public policy than, oops, they're getting unequal outcomes, we've got to spend money here, we've got to spend money there, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, we've got to change that rule, right. That's a much more complicated policy agenda, which of course is part of the appeal, particularly to various non-profits, bureaucracies and so forth, who just live off this whole gravy train of, we're going to fix this, we're going to fix that, we're going to fix that. Conversely, if you go back to, no, same rules for everyone, same tests for everyone, just let things fall where they may, that's a much simpler policy apparatus, and there's a lot less for the various busybodies to do, both in and out of government. So there's an interesting trade-off there.
Do you think the reason why people would push back against that notion is typically because, to borrow Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, where he talks about the difference between those who are liberal and those who are conservative, quite broad brush terms, but liberals typically tend to care more about care and fairness and justice, whereas conservatives will care about those things to a slightly lesser degree, because they are then balancing out things like sanctity and tradition and loyalty. And then within that, you've got libertarians, I suppose, on both sides that will actually be proponents of some of the ideals that you're talking about, which is just let the chips fall down. But obviously, when people see outcomes, if they typically care about care, fairness, justice, they'll go, hang on, but if we let the chips fall where they fall, and we see individuals, but they typically see people as groups of people falling by the wayside, then we must do something about it. Would your rejoinder to that be that actually by doing so sends a signal that whoever you are, whatever group you are part of, if that's the way you see the world, it's a call to get your ducks in a row, to find a way to raise yourself up to those standards and to culturally change in that way? Is that what you would hope for by doing this, or is it more just let's just see what happens and that's the fair way of doing things?
Yes, I mean, one of the things about all this is letting people know what works. I mean, that's actually really quite important, because if you keep saying, well, it's not there's nothing you've done wrong. It's some evil sociological gremlins in the society which is doing this to you. That's very, very bad for trying to work out, no, actually, there are things you could do which would make things better for you. And so part of the problem with this is it's suppressing information that people should have about what works and what works, what doesn't work. But I would also caution, the chips where it's made doesn't mean that you mightn't have some sort of safety net, because you might still have a safety net. It's just whoever falls down there, regardless of what group they belong to, are treated in the same way, right? So, Hayek, who's not a big government guy, he was quite calm about them being some sort of safety net to catch people. So was Milton Friedman, for that matter. So it's not necessarily that you want to completely, Darwinian process in your social arrangements, but it is going back to, yes, we can have this, but we don't have it targeted at identity groups. We just say, if you fall into this category, then you are eligible for this or that, right? So it's very much about allowing things to move forward in an even-handed way without expecting that will result in even outcomes. And, as a sort of reinforce the point further, you've really got to think about what information, what signals are you sending to people? If you say, well, if your group's doing badly, then it's all in someone else's fault. Someone else is doing to you, and not saying, there's probably a bit of a story here. What are your life strategies? How are they being propagated? Is this working for you? I'm not a libertarian. I'm quite strong on freedom, and I think governments nowadays do way too much. But I'm not a libertarian. And one of those sort of unfortunate historical truths is by far the best community ever for getting people to not fall through the cracks, for general uplift, was Puritan New England. And that was not a very free society. That was an intensely theocratic, minding your neighbour's business society. But because it had a set of rules that worked, even people in other societies would be feckless failures, were pushed into prudential behaviour that was actually successful. So there's, as often in human affairs, some really unsettling trade-offs to be had in these things when you start thinking these things through. Very unsettling trade-offs.
We'll all be walking around dressed as pilgrims before we know it. So I'd like to get into the dangers of the hereditarian worldview, perhaps if it was misconstrued, which I'm sure it so often is. And there's a bit of pretext to the question. As you were describing the pitfalls of going down the identitarian worldview and dividing people purely into groups, and then trying to reorder society so some groups are given more resources or focus because they have been determined to be more deserving and others aren't, is that can cause conflict. And as you said, you were talking about these groups ultimately feeling as though there's a sociological gremlin, which is the reason why they're being held back. And a danger to me seems that can be applied totally on the other side. So if anyone is taking a hereditarian worldview and focusing purely on things like race and ethnicity, and, well, there's clear differences between us groups. And if I look at my political opponents on the other side, who are saying that they're sociological gremlins keeping me down and we must rebalance things, and then they end up, whoever it is, the proponents of it start trying to reorder society, is those people who are being impacted by that, who started to take that hereditarian view, at least purely from a race and ethnicity point of view, could go, well, hang on, I can see the sociological gremlins forming against me right now, and now I'm being held down. And if we're all so different, then perhaps I deserve more because I'm being kept back. Do you think that is one of the dangers of the hereditarian worldview and losing this sense of freedom, equality, ability to talk about things as you see them arising in real time instead of putting a taboo and a suppression around the subject?
Yes. To marry together the identitarian idea, a very strong concept of groups, with the hereditarian idea is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. If you're saying you're acknowledging there's differences between groups, but then you don't acknowledge that groups are populations. They're families and individuals together as populations. And so when you say we're not getting equal outcomes between groups, that's a statistical comment, right? So some people in one group will do very well, and some group in another group will do badly, but it's just that one group has more of the former and less of the latter, right? But there's going to be a huge amount of overlap. So the problem with the identitarian thing is it puts these hard boundaries around what are human populations, which are fuzzy boundary things, right? And so, yes, if you're going to marry hereditarianism with conflict theory, you are setting yourself up for very, very nasty outcomes and nasty social strife. And of course, I mean, go back to Jim Crow. That's exactly what Jim Crow did, right? It said that the whites were better, the blacks were worse. These are groups that have to be defined very, very separately. And, you know, it was the one drop rule. If you had any African ancestry, you were in that group, and you had to be pure European to be in the other group. So, yes, I mean, there's incredible dangers in putting hard boundaries around groups. But I would point out that, of course, the equalitarians do the same. The identitarian equalitarians do this very, very precisely, and it's having very invidious problems. And one of the things that's a real danger on the equalitarian side is if a group does unusually well, they've got their acts together in various ways, that means they're targets. Because if your explanation of success is oppression, because your explanation of lack of success is oppression, then if a group does particularly well, they effectively become the new kulaks, aren't they? They're the group that's exploiting others. That's the only explanation for them doing well, because that's the only explanation that you're letting in. And you can see this in the US with the way the Jews have become a targeted group on the grounds that they're successful. Asian Americans became a targeted group on the grounds that they're successful. Now, it's sort of surreptitious, but the Ivy League universities were clearly putting the thumb on the scale to keep Asian Americans out because they were doing too well. And it was, the justification was to let more African Americans in, but then you're back to you've screwed up the equal process for everyone, equal rules for everybody. You're putting your thumb on the scale in all sorts of ways, and you can't do that in a way that is actually fair, because it was clearly ridiculous that an African American would get one result on the SAT, an Asian American would get a different result, and there was a penalty. I mean, people could mathematically deduce the penalty for being Asian American and the benefit for being African American. So yes, whether you do it on a hereditarian basis or whether you do it on an equalitarian basis, putting these hard boundaries around groups is a very, very dangerous thing, because then everything becomes zero-sum. It's, what my group is getting, your group isn't. And yes, and it's also, of course, going to be false, because you look at the outcomes and there's going to be a real spread in each group. Okay, so there are rich African Americans and there are poor Asian Americans and there are, poor Euro Americans. And in fact, this is actually one of those things where people who argue against the hereditarian discussion at a genetic level between groups of humans, one of the things they say is variation between groups is much larger than variation between variation within groups is much larger than variation between groups, which of course is true. But then they don't apply that backwards, because they're exactly the same point applies to the equalitarian building big barriers against groups. If, as is true, the variation in social outcomes within groups is bigger than the variation in social outcomes between groups, it is typically much bigger, then clearly the group membership isn't the crucial thing, is it? You've got a statistical propensity going on, but it's not actually determining the outcomes. Rather, your group membership isn't determining outcomes. One group's got various statistical benefits from, different life strategies, perhaps genetic differences, plus interactions between them. But it's not actually the group that's divided. It's not the group membership that's driving this. So it's a very dangerous way to think of the world.
And a way that is frequently employed to view the world, and we see it in institutions, and you touched on it when you were talking about the Ivy League institutions, the universities, having their thumbs on the scale in the admissions process. I was actually speaking to someone who was in the corporate world, working for a very large organization, quite influential, and each year they have performance year-end reviews, and within that everyone goes and gathers all sorts of feedback on how well they've done on projects and what their colleagues think of them and what clients think of them and all of those things. And then they all go and get their cases put forward by someone who's representing them to try and determine what their score will be, which will determine what their salary and their bonus will be. And then they all have a conflab and say, right, this is what these people are getting. And promotions are decided on the back of it as well. He then said it was the first time he then realized there was a diversity and inclusion champion, which then applied a separate score to the end of year process. And one of the people he was looking after, he was white, he was Australian, this was in Australia, and the diversity and inclusion score then ended up dropping his end of year score, which meant he missed out on promotion. And he said, so just to be clear, he's not getting promoted because of his sex and his ethnicity. And the answer to that was yes, in a very roundabout, mumbled fashion, is the way he relayed it to me. And so he had effectively had to go and tell them that for diversity and inclusion purposes, he's not going to be getting promoted this year. So there are thumbs on the scale going on all over the place, and perhaps we should start digging into the worldview that we've been touching on and we've been skirting around.